It doesn't really seem that long since I last took a look at the RX 5700 XT, and I remember being fairly impressed. Lately, I've been seeing a lot of my colleagues on YouTube feel the same way, especially considering its reasonable asking price and broad compatibility compared to older Polaris and Vegas. The thing is, I promise I'm not trying to be contrary, I think I've changed my mind. The RX 5700 XT was one of the best value graphics cards in my GOAT project last year, in which I tried to determine which was the best flagship GPU of all time, or at least as far back as 2013. Admittedly, it was one of the few cards in the test that wasn't a true flagship, as there was no AMD alternative to the RTX 2080 Ti, but in terms of frames per dollar in the games of its era, it was one of the best I'd ever tested. Not a lot of people have nostalgia for the 5700 XT, or RDNA 1 in general, probably due to a bunch of technical issues around launch, but in retrospect, it was a pretty good generation. In the context of 2023, it was still a great buy. Used prices fell below those of the RX 6600 and RTX 2060, both of which were pretty hard to get, and while the 6600 has the arguable benefit of crappy ray tracing, the 2060 was humbled in every non-RT test. Plus, 2023 saw a big spike in big-name games that required 8GB of VRAM as a minimum. Now, in 2025, used prices are lower than ever. Some chips have been recycled into new cards from lesser-known brands on AliExpress, so surely there's even more reason to consider the 5700 XT. To find out, I'm running it through a gauntlet of modern games on a moderately priced gaming PC, consisting of a Ryzen 5 7500F and 32GB of crucial DDR5. Thanks to Ubisoft for providing me with access to Assassin's Creed Shadows, the newest game in my benchmark roster, and the latest example of a game built on the Anvil Next engine. I played through the first 90 minutes of the game at native 1080p medium, which was fine. 40 FPS or so most of the time, the graphics looked good, but textures were a bit on the low res side. I later found turning up texture quality did very little to improve the quality of them, and I assume this is because the setting is called texture streaming, and so it kinda doesn't really matter what you choose. If you don't have enough VRAM, the game won't give you high-res textures. Alas, 8GB isn't enough to get the good stuff, so some materials will look pretty poor regardless. Once I got to a place I felt confident I could make a repeatable benchmark run, I saw an average of 45 FPS at medium, and dropping to low only saw that climb to 50. Going the other way, however, dropped the average to just 37. I was able to reach 60 plus on average, but only at 1080 low with FSR quality, and of course image quality is pretty poor at that point. If there's one game the 5700 XT is ideally suited to this year, it's Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. I was able to turn up to 1080p high and still see an excellent 70 plus average, using temporal AA and no upscaling. Unfortunately, there's not quite enough headroom to go any higher than this. Ultra drops to 50 FPS with lows in the low 40s, which is playable enough, but less ideal for a first-person game. Still, high settings in a 2025 game is good news for the 5700 XT. And with that out of the way, here's the first bad news. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, another of the best reviewed titles of the last 6 months, doesn't work. The 5700 XT meets the system requirements in every respect, bar one. It lacks hardware ray tracing. Now, that might not worry you. Perhaps you don't care about a movie franchise that's taken a turn for the worse in the 21st century, but this also means that you won't be able to play Doom: The Dark Ages, and it doesn't bode well for other future releases either. Now, I've heard rumours about a way of emulating RT hardware in Linux, and if you're already a Linux user, or were looking for an excuse to excise Windows from your PC anyway, then it might be something to look into. I may have to try it for myself one of these days, but for now, I'm not going to recommend getting a 5700 XT on the premise of maybe being able to emulate hardware RT. Avowed is the first of 3 games I've tested that uses Unreal Engine 5. an engine that's capable of great wonders and great atrocities. Avowed suffers some of the UE5 stutter that we've come to expect, and at 1080p medium that means a near 50 FPS average, but 1% lows in the 30s. The low preset rockets up the average to over 70 FPS, but lows are still only 2/3 of the average, so it's not the smoothest experience, but that's not really the GPU's fault. Another technically deeply flawed game, Spider-Man 2 suffers from very poor frame pacing when swinging along in NYC, which is like half the game. You'd have a better time walking, but I think that will be missing the point. A better CPU would help slightly, but not much. At 1080p medium, the average is 71 FPS, but 1% lows are less than half that. A 7800X 3D usually gives 1% lows that are about 40% lower than the average, which is still atrocious, but a bit better than the Ryzen 5 in this system. Unfortunately, the only solution I've found so far is frame gen, and I'm not a big fan of that. Dragon Age Veilguard is built on the latest version of the Frostbite engine, and is one of the better PC ports lately. At 1080p high with TAA, I saw an average of 54 FPS with lows in the mid-40s, so reaching 60 should be fairly easy if you don't mind dropping your standards a bit. Horizon Forbidden West is another decent quality port, this time of a title that originated on console, with the frame rate at 1080p very high, averaging in the low 50s. A 60 FPS experience means dropping to medium, but that does send FPS all the way up to 70. I'm not used to God of War Ragnarok being a problem, but it seems like it would prefer to have more than 8GB of RAM here. 1080p high is doable, averaging in the low 60s, but this is with a memory warning in the menu. That could mean the game will have issues with loading assets, or perhaps stuttering, or even crashing later down the line, so I'd be inclined to stick with low, which averages almost 80 FPS. Ubisoft's other recent game, this time built on the Snowdrop engine, Star Wars Outlaws is another heavy VRAM drinker. At 1080 high, it can just pull off 30 FPS, but there's a lot of stuttering, and I dare say you might find some missing textures and other assets the longer you play. Medium averages 40 FPS, but is much smoother overall, while low only gains 10% over medium. The second title of the video to run on UE5, Black Myth Wukong can be surprisingly smooth at 1080p medium, averaging 65 FPS. Alas, it doesn't look great at these settings, and to really iron out some of those issues with pop-in, you have to raise the preset to very high, which only manages 40 FPS with lows close to 30. Good old Cyberpunk, remember when this game was the toughest one to run? Well, I guess with path tracing that can still be true, but that's not even an option here. At native 1080 high, with no ray tracing to speak of, the average in the canned benchmark reaches over 70 FPS. Alan Wake 2 was always one of the games that didn't really sit right on RDNA 1 GPUs at first, what with the need for DX12 Ultimate and all. That requirement might well have been dropped, but this really is not a good choice of graphics card for this game. At 1080 low, you can get a non-terrible average of 35 FPS, and even at medium it doesn't look all that bad, but both deliver very low lows, thanks mainly to dynamic shadows when turning the torch on. Finally, the last game and another UE5 title, Marvel Rivals has a low preset which still runs some quite heavy reflections and global illumination, so to get the best competitive experience from a relatively weak GPU, it's worth turning them off. At the minimum settings, the card can reach almost 100 FPS without resorting to upscaling. Meanwhile at low, without turning the fancy settings off, it's about 20% slower. While writing the conclusion for this video, I rewatched my 2023 review of this card, and I can't quite believe the difference. 2 years ago, I was talking about this as a 1440p card, occasionally capable of 4K. Even then, however, I was aware that the 8GB frame buffer was becoming a limiting factor, and 2 years later, that's very much the case. We're now seeing more games that rely on software ray tracing, which is pretty heavy on this GPU and is a big part of why many of these games only run at 40 to 50 FPS, even at medium settings. If you're happy to stick with those 2023 era games and earlier, and if you have as many games in your backlog as I do, then I'm sure you could be, then the 5700 XT can still be an excellent GPU and a real bargain these days. Alas, 2025 is a different kettle of fish altogether. And when it comes to today's games, the 5700 XT doesn't look like such a bargain next to a similarly priced 6600 or 6600 XT. You might even want to look at something like a 1080 Ti instead, at least while it still has some level of driver support. I might look at revisiting the GOAT again soon. It's been a couple of years, and I'm curious to see how it's holding up in 2025. In the meantime, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.